Megan Avery?
Yeah, what is this?
We need to talk account adjustments made under your login.
A 33-year-old woman is standing behind the teller counter, still holding a stack of deposit slips, when police walk in and order her to put her hands where they can see them.
Those were routine corrections. I work those accounts every day.
The person you are looking at is Megan Claire Avery. At this moment, she is being handcuffed by police right behind the teller counter at Harbor Palms Community Credit Union, a small credit union in Tampa, Florida. She is suspected of using her internal access to create fake account adjustment orders, allowing her to drain a total of $96 and $500 from 14 elderly customers.
Hey, don't make it sound like I did something wrong.
Most of these customers did not use online banking. They rarely checked their accounts, and many of them had trusted Megan as a dedicated employee who was always ready to print their statements, check their balances, and explain every line of their money. But to understand why a woman once seen as the most trusted person behind the glass ended up in handcuffs at her own workplace, we have to go back to the beginning. And before we start, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. Megan Claire Avery was born in 1991 and grew up in the suburbs of Tampa, Florida. She was the second daughter in an ordinary middle-class family. Her father worked as an air conditioning technician, and her mother was a receptionist at a small dental clinic. People who knew Megan when she was younger described her as quiet, gentle, and not especially attention-seeking. But she had a way of making people feel comfortable when they spoke to her. After graduating from high school, Megan studied applied accounting at a local community college. She did not follow a path into high finance. She did not work on Wall Street. She did not walk into glass towers or corporate boardrooms. Instead, Megan chose community banking, a slower, more personal world where everything depended heavily on trust. At 33, Megan was a senior teller and member service representative at Harbor Palms Community Credit Union, a fictional small credit union located in North Tampa. She had worked there for nearly 7 years. To her coworkers, Megan was careful, conflict avoidant, punctual, and especially good with elderly customers. She remembered their names. She remembered their habits. She knew who needed printed statements, who often forgot their PIN, and who did not know how to use a banking app on a phone. Megan was unmarried and lived alone in an apartment about 15 minutes from the branch. To her neighbors, she was polite and kept a reasonable distance. To her family, she was stable. A daughter with a clean office job, no obvious trouble, no flashy lifestyle. To the elderly customers at Harbor Palms, Megan was more than a bank employee. She was like a kind granddaughter behind the glass, patiently explaining each line on a statement, leaning down to hear repeated questions, and smiling as if none of it ever bothered her. And that image is what makes this case so unsettling. Because the person accused of taking the money was not a stranger running a scam from far away. It was the person the victims had once trusted enough to slide their savings book through the teller window. Megan began her career as a part-time teller at a retail bank branch. Her first tasks were simple: accepting deposits, printing receipts, helping customers check balances, and correcting small transaction issues during the day. She was not a powerful person, but she stood in a very sensitive position, the point of contact between customers and their money. After a few years, Megan moved to Harbor Palms Community Credit Union. It was not a large institution. It had only 2 branches, 21 employees, and around 11,400 members. Most of its members were retirees, local workers, retired teachers, and middle-income families. People did not walk into Harbor Palms the way they walked into a cold, impersonal bank. They walked in as if entering a familiar place. Elderly people in the area often came to Harbor Palms for more than just transactions. They came because someone there knew their name. Someone asked about their back pain. Someone remembered that their spouse had passed away the previous month. Someone would patiently print the same statement for the third time without showing irritation. Over time, Megan built an image of a gentle and trustworthy employee. She was not overly familiar in a way that raised suspicion, but she was close enough to make customers feel safe. She knew who lived alone. She knew who did not use online banking. She knew who rarely checked their accounts. She knew who might assume that if their balance looked wrong, maybe they had simply remembered it incorrectly. No one at the branch thought Megan would be the person to exploit the very system she served. No one thought she would look at the most vulnerable elderly customers, the ones least comfortable with technology, and turn their trust into a weakness she could use. At its core, a credit union works like a community bank owned by its members. Customers are not just customers, they are called members. They deposit money, open savings accounts, receive debit cards, take out small loans, and are supported by employees they often recognize by face. On paper, the system has multiple layers of control. Every transaction has an employee ID. Every balance adjustment leaves a trace. Cash withdrawals require documentation. Changes to an account must come with a valid reason. But in practice, a small credit union often relies heavily on internal trust. For minor transaction errors, employees can create adjustment orders. For example, if a fee was wrongly deducted, a transaction was posted incorrectly, a refund needed updating, or a discrepancy had to be balanced in the system. These actions are generally called adjustments. They do not always attract attention, especially when the amount is not large and the note attached to it sounds reasonable. The vulnerability lies in that gray area. An adjustment of a few $1,000s can look like a technical correction. A low-activity account might not be checked for months. An 82-year-old customer who does not use a smartphone may never receive an instant notification. And if the employee making the adjustment is someone everyone trusts, the system may take much longer to start asking questions. Megan understood that better than anyone. She did not need to hack the system. She did not need to break into a vault. She only needed to know which accounts stayed quiet long enough, which customers checked rarely enough, and which numbers were small enough to pass as routine administrative corrections. At first, it was only a small amount. According to the fictional investigation file, the first transaction was under $2,000. It was entered as an internal adjustment with a vague reason, posting correction. No alarm went off. No manager called Megan into an office. No customer immediately came back to ask why money had disappeared. A number small enough to be overlooked became the test. When nothing was detected, Megan allegedly went further. She reviewed low-activity accounts. She selected elderly customers who did not use mobile banking. She focused on people who usually asked her to print statements instead of checking online themselves. Each time, she created a manual adjustment order using harmless-sounding notes like member request balancing or correction review. Over 18 months from early 2023 to mid-2024, a total of 31 internal adjustment orders appeared around the suspicious accounts. Some transactions were a few $1,000s. Some were close to $5,000. None were large enough to shake the entire system immediately. But when placed side by side, they formed a trail. The money did not disappear in one day. It was taken in pieces, in slow cuts, like someone slicing quietly into an old piece of fabric. By the time anyone noticed, the tier had stretched across 14 accounts. Megan was also accused of being linked to 7 cash withdrawals connected to those adjustments. The method was not especially complicated, but it was cold. She allegedly used her internal access to make the numbers look reasonable, then let the money move through gaps that the control system did not examine closely enough. By mid-2023, the amount began to grow quickly. The adjustments were no longer scattered minor discrepancies. They had become a pattern. Every few weeks, a low-activity account would show unusual activity. Most of those accounts belonged to people between 71 and 89 years old. While the numbers were being quietly worn down, Megan kept standing behind the counter with the same expression. She still asked about customers' health. She still helped them check balances. She still printed receipts. She still explained that certain transaction lines were only system errors, delayed updates, or normal technical issues. The total amount she was accused of taking eventually reached $96,500. For a large financial corporation, that might be nothing more than a line in a risk report. But for the victims in this case, it was medicine money, nursing home money, savings left behind after a spouse had passed away, emergency money for the final years of life. What made the case heavier was that Megan did not appear to change much. She did not show up with a luxury car. She did not buy a large house. She did not post photos of a glamorous lifestyle. Some of the money was allegedly used for personal debts, living expenses, credit cards, and small repeated purchases. That normality made the behavior harder to detect. There was no single flashy moment that made people suspicious, only aging, quiet accounts losing money bit by bit. In front of everyone, Megan kept saying everything was fine. To elderly customers, she remained the most patient person in the branch. To coworkers, she was still the employee trusted with difficult cases. But behind the transaction screen, a list was quietly growing. Everything began to change because of one receipt. In July 2024, an 82-year-old customer named Arthur Bennett came to Harbor Palms to check his balance. He was a retired electrician living alone after his wife had passed away, and he almost never used online banking. That day, Arthur needed to know exactly how much money he had left so he could pay for heart medication and a deposit for in-home care. Megan helped him the way she had many times before. She asked about his health, made a small comment about the Tampa heat, and printed a receipt. But the first piece of paper showed a strange adjustment line. Arthur's account balance was lower than expected by exactly $700. Megan immediately told him it was only a printer issue, or that the system had pulled old data by mistake. She took back the paper, printed another receipt, and tried to reassure him. For a younger person, the moment might have ended right there at the counter. But Arthur took the first receipt home. It had become stuck inside his medical paperwork, and later his daughter found it. Arthur's daughter, Marissa Bennett, was not someone easily dismissed by the phrase system error. She called the credit union and demanded an explanation. Then she requested 18 months of account statements. At first, everything was still described as a technical mistake. But the closer Marissa looked, the more something felt wrong. A $4,700 amount does not disappear on its own. An adjustment line does not appear by itself. And if it truly was a system error, why had the employee been so quick to take back the first receipt? From that question, the internal control team began reviewing the records. They found additional warning signs, multiple low-activity accounts showing transactions during Megan's shifts, adjustment memos missing proper verification notes, several adjustment amounts staying below the threshold for deeper approval, and some elderly customers who had received account verification calls, even though they had not requested any service. The numbers began to speak for themselves, and they all pointed to the same person. As the internal review expanded, the story was no longer about one misprinted receipt. It became a structured picture. Auditors pulled bank statements, login records, internal camera footage, adjustment memos, and cash transaction files. They did not find one major withdrawal. What they found was a series of smaller transactions, repeated with calculation. Each one could be explained in isolation, but placed together, they became almost impossible to deny. The money moved from elderly customers' accounts into internal adjustments, then connected to cash withdrawals or balance changes that had no valid request from the account holder. In total, 14 customers were affected. The youngest was 71, the oldest was 89. 5 of them only learned something was wrong when they needed money for medication or long-term care. The key evidence appeared when an investigator examined Megan's work computer. On it was a personal note file titled Low Activity Members. That list included the names of 11 of the 14 victims. Megan initially explained that the list was meant to help members who needed extra support. It sounded reasonable, especially for an employee known for being attentive to elderly customers. But the file access history showed that the list had been opened several times shortly before suspicious transactions occurred. What had been presented as a customer care list began to look like a map of targets. Internal camera footage also made the story deteriorate quickly. In several clips, Megan accessed customer profiles when no customer was standing in front of her counter. Some of those access events happened near the end of shifts when the branch was quiet. Others occurred shortly before adjustment orders were created. Arthur Bennett's receipt was the first piece of the puzzle, but the system data was what locked the case into place. On August 19, 2024, police arrived at the Harbor Palms branch in North Tampa. That morning began like any other. The branch had been open for less than 20 minutes. Florida sunlight came through the front glass. An elderly woman sat waiting to reactivate her debit card. An older man stood at the deposit counter holding a cash envelope. The sound of the money counter hummed steadily in the small space. Claire Avery stood behind the glass. On her shirt was the familiar name badge, Megan, Member Services. In her hand was a stack of deposit slips. Everything looked normal in a way that felt almost frightening. Then the front door opened. 2 police officers walked in with an investigator from the credit union. There was no shouting, no chaos. Only footsteps across the tile floor and a silence that spread very quickly. An employee in the back stopped typing. The man at the deposit counter turned his head. The elderly woman sitting in the waiting area looked up. One officer asked, "Megan Claire Avery?" She looked up. For a few seconds, she kept the professional smile that customers had seen hundreds of times. Then she looked toward the manager's office. That door was open. The investigator placed a file on the counter. On the first page was a copy of Arthur Bennett's receipt with the $4,700 adjustment circled. Megan did not ask what was happening. She did not act surprised. She simply placed the deposit slips on the counter. The body cam recorded the moment she put her hands out before the officer even had to ask. A few minutes later, the woman once trusted most by elderly customers was handcuffed at the place where she had worked for nearly 7 years. Prosecutors charged Megan with multiple offenses related to theft, financial fraud, falsifying or misusing internal transaction records, and financial exploitation of elderly people. Because this is a fictionalized documentary-style case, the charges are built around patterns commonly seen in financial fraud cases involving community institutions. According to the charging file, Megan was accused of exploiting her position as senior teller to access low-activity accounts, create improper adjustments, mislabel the nature of transactions, and conceal the movement of money inside the internal system. The total loss was determined to be $96. At first, Megan denied intentionally stealing money. She said some transactions were system errors, some were correction procedures, and asked them were customer requests for which she no longer had documentation. But that explanation collapsed under 5 groups of evidence: Arthur's misprinted receipt, Megan's employee ID attached to 31 adjustments, the low-activity members list, internal camera footage, and the match between 7 cash withdrawals and balance changes. After months of investigation and legal negotiation, Megan eventually pleaded guilty to the main charges. At the hearing, some victims and their relatives were allowed to speak. No one shouted in anger. What made the room heavier was the exhaustion in every sentence. One daughter said her 79-year-old mother no longer dared to go to the bank alone after the case. One man said his father had trusted Megan more than the banking app because she talked like family. Arthur Bennett, the man who had kept the first receipt, said only one short sentence: "I did not lose the most money, but I lost the feeling that I know who to trust." The court sentenced Megan to 4 years and 8 months in prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release, and ordered her to repay the full $96,500 to the victims and the credit union. She was also banned from working in any position that would give her access to customer accounts, cash, or financial transaction systems. But a sentence cannot immediately repair what was lost. Harbor Palms Community Credit Union reimbursed the victims, but it could not give them back their old sense of safety. After the case, the branch had to freeze and review hundreds of accounts belonging to elderly customers. Many people had to return to sign documents, verify transactions, change PINs, update security information, and work with relatives to review their full financial history. For a younger person used to a banking app, that might be only a few days of inconvenience. But for people in their 80s, it was a shock. They had to sit in front of long account statements, look at transaction lines they did not understand, and wonder how much had happened without their knowledge. 5 victims experienced delays in paying for medication, medical care, or nursing home expenses. 3 families had to temporarily cover costs for their parents while the accounts were being reviewed. Some people stopped going to the branch alone. Some asked their children or grandchildren to go with them. Some moved their money to another bank, even though they were not sure the new place would be any safer. For the small Tampa community around Harbor Palms, the case left a crack that was hard to see but very deep. This was not just the story of one employee taking $96,500. It was the story of elderly people who had believed the credit union was one of the last places they could enter without needing to defend themselves. After the case, Harbor Palms changed its control procedures. Every adjustment on an elderly customer's account required 2 levels of approval. Low-activity accounts were placed under a separate monitoring system. Employees were no longer allowed to make verification calls unless a ticket had been created first. Teller camera footage was reviewed regularly. Those changes were necessary, but they were also an admission that before this, trust had been used in place of control. The cruelest part was that many victims could no longer tell who was truly trying to help them and who was simply studying their weaknesses. A 76-year-old woman said at a member meeting that she used to feel safe when bank employees remembered her name. After this case, she no longer wanted anyone at the bank to know too much about her life. That was the real aftermath. It was not on the balance sheet. It was not in the restitution order. It was not in the prison sentence. It lived in the moment when an elderly person held a savings folder at the teller counter and, for the first time, wondered whether the smile behind the glass could still be trusted. Megan Avery did not need to use force. She did not need to break a lock. She did not need to enter anyone's home. She only needed to stand in the right place, speak in the right gentle voice, and wait for the people least likely to check. One misprinted receipt exposed everything. But before that piece of paper appeared, there had been 18 months of silence, 18 months of aging accounts being drained little by little, 18 months in which people who had worked their entire lives to save money unknowingly placed it in the hands of someone they trusted. And perhaps that's why fraud cases like this always feel colder than ordinary robberies. Because in a robbery, the victim knows they are being attacked. But in this case, they smiled, said thank you, and walked out of the credit union without knowing that the person who had just helped them print a statement might also be the person making their final savings disappear.